Okay. Now, I'll get rid of I'll centralize our fetch window in just a second, but what I want to do first is come back to our Canvas homepage and remind you that under our class resources page, you will find a version of our rule sheet. So what I did yesterday was I downloaded it, and you can also load it inline, right? So if you have any questions about we know that these two sentences are, hey Zeev, we know these two sentences are tautologically equivalent, right? That is, these two sentences, they are De Morgan, they're called De Morgan's equivalences, and they have identical truth values on every row of the truth table in the column under their main connective, which means in some versions of the system that we're learning, when you're in a derivation, you can just substitute them. And when you substitute one for the other, they're called, the rule is typically called, De Morgan's 1 or De Morgan's 2, depending on the version of the system you're learning. What we're doing, however, in our version of the system is we're actually proving the De Morgan's equivalence. Okay, so this is our version of the system in this sense is really powerful. So now so one of the rules that we wanted to review is the negation intro rule. And can you guys please let me know if you do not see on the screen that I'm sharing with you the negation intro rule form? Okay, I'm looking, it looks like everybody sees it. Okay, now the other question for you is, do you remember that the rule sheet that I've given you is a less sort of visually complicated version, but the rules are also given to you in their technical fullness on, what is it, page 557 of the text. So if you have your text with you, you might want to look up the rule sheet there. Okay, so let me try to kill two birds with one stone, as it were, per poor birdie. The first is, as I said, we're going to prove one of the De Morgan's equivalences. The other is we're going to review negation intro. So let me talk about proving the sentence by way of negation intro in strategic terms. So here's a strategy. Are you ready? The strategy is this. When your conclusion, so here I've written the conclusion as the goal, right? When your conclusion is a negated sentence, your strategy will be to employ negation intro. In other words, we want to start thinking about our rules as follows. Our rules provide us, particularly when we're thinking about subproofs, our rules provide us with backward looking or backward working approaches, right? So let's think about working backward this way. If you guys and I decide while we're under stay-at-home precautions that we want to meet to have cocktails, and for those of you who don't drink, that's fine. You have a club soda or something. I love club soda too. We decide we want to meet for drinks, right, on Friday at 6. And we're gonna have a Zoom meeting. It'll be so much fun. If we know that we're meeting at 6. And we know that in order to be on our Zoom meeting at 6 o'clock, there are things we need to do. Is it fair to say that we use our 6 p.m. meeting as our end point? That is, we use it as our finish line to guide us to get there. Similarly, if you're going to run a marathon, everybody's at the starting line, right? It's not the case that when the starter pistol goes off, everybody runs off in 8 million different directions. Instead, people move toward the finish line, which was set out in advance, and that finish line, which was set out in advance, guides us. Okay, so now take those ways of thinking, apply them here. Our finish line, our goal, negation, parentheses A, disjunction B, close parenthesis, that is our goal, that's our finish line. Because the negation governs the finish line, governs the goal, we look over to negation intro, right, to tell us what to do. That's going to be our roadmap. That is going to be the path that we use. So we say, let's assume that A, disjunction B, is the case. I will end up, I say to myself, generating a contradiction so that I can exit the subproof and say that the assumption that A or B is the case is false. Thoughts. Right? So when your conclusion is a negation, so here's how we're going to start to speak. We're going to start to speak in strategic terms. When your conclusion is a negated sentence, set up negation intro. Is this an absolute rule in terms of a strategy that you must do this all the time? No, but for right now, we're going to pretend like it is. Okay? All right, so we set up our negation intro. Now, here is another strategic way of thinking. At present, the conclusion of our subproof is a contradiction. So let's work backward from our contradiction. What do we need to do to generate a contradiction? Well, do you see two implicit contradictions? B and not B, not A and A. Yeah? I said implicit contradiction. Remember, in logic, we make every step explicit. We don't want to gloss over anything. There are times when legally, logically, we can gloss over a step, but that doesn't mean that we should, right? And there are going to be times when Fitch will tell us, hey, you glossed over something, you can't do that. You shouldn't do it. All right, so let's move now to how we're going to achieve the explicit contradiction. Well, take a look at your rules again. Notice that when you're given, and I'm circling disjunction, the disjunction under Disjunction Elim, I hope you see that. When you have a disjunction, you are going to eliminate it, right? So remember, a disjunction is true in three ways. So when we're given a disjunction, we don't know if the disjunction is true because each of the disjuncts is true, the left disjunct is true, or the right disjunct is true. So we say, well, let's assume that the left disjunct is true, right? Now, we've got a conjunction at line 1. What tactic do we use when we have a conjunction? We eliminate it. And now I can make my contradiction explicit, right? So I've got 1/2 of my disjunction elim sequence that yields a contradiction. Now we move on to the next. We assume B. We go ahead and eliminate the conjunction. We assert our contradiction. Okay, so couple things here because we're not, physically together in class and I can't see you, and I'm not criticizing you for that. If you want to turn your camera on, turn it on. If you don't want to turn it on, don't turn it on. But because I can't see you, I'm just going to rely on you to pipe up in some fashion and let me know if you have a question, problem, confusion. Is there a point where I went too quickly? How are we doing? What do you think?
It seems good. For line 4 and 8, no, 4 and 7, would you have it so that it references the first line, or is it fine to just have it written like not A and not B?
Okay, so if I understand your terrific question, Lewis, you're saying, you're asking the following: must I eliminate the conjunction at line 1?
No,
No?
like just for Fitch, when you write like how we have not A there,
Yes.
it's like an assumption that we had that it's like part of our it's like a premise that we accept as true, and we know that because it's in line 1.
Yes.
And normally, like for example, line 5 we have to like, or not line 5, line 9 we have to reference 2 different like sub pieces
Yes.
to it.
Yes.
Yeah, so like for line 4 and 7, would we have to reference 1 because it's like, oh, we got it from this line.
Beautiful. Yeah, you do. So
Okay.
let's go ahead and cite those. Let me also say I'm going to go ahead and for the moment just pretend that we didn't eliminate not A at line 5 and not B at line 8. You could, if you want, eliminate them first and then reference them within the subproof. So we can talk about that in just a moment. But yeah, you are correct. Dereje, what are you thinking? I think it looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah. The thing is, are you trying to prove with your subproof that it doesn't lead to the conclusion? I mean, the steps you are taking from 2 to 9.
Right. So let me adjust your language somewhat. We are trying to prove by making the assumption at line 2 that saying the conclusion is false, which is what we're saying at line 2, leads to a contradiction.
Which is the wrong way.
Yeah,
at the end of the day, it's not going to work.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to prove with that number 2.
Yeah.
And then it's self-statements.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a nice way to think about it. We're basically, and it's a wonderful approach to take, which is to say, hey, I know this argument is valid, or, in this case, I know these two statements are tautologically equivalent. What if I say, I don't believe you, right? So what if I say, I don't think the argument is valid, or I don't think that they're equivalent? I do that by way of generating a contradiction within the context of the negation intro subproof.
So you're doing the calculation that leads to the conclusion.
Yes. Yeah. We're determining. Each move that we make we can back up effectively from the big picture standpoint with a truth table, right? Where we have the sentence 1, which is both A and B are not, and the conclusion, which says neither one is, right? So, right, if we're saying both are not the case, that means that neither one is. Two ways of saying the same thing in terms of the truth table. And then what we're doing in Fitch is we're saying, okay, I'm going to demonstrate. Does that help a little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Of course. So now let's go ahead and and cite. So this cite and justify. So this is what Lewis was after earlier. Notice, by the way, lines 1, 2, and 3 are assumptive steps, right? So 1 was given to us. We further assumed 2. We further assumed 3. Now it's not until we get to line 4 that we need to start citing and justifying. So do me a favor, guys, and take a look at Conjunction Elim. Tell me if you can't see that rule, right? Conjunction Elim, look at that rule. Now look at lines 1 and 4. Look at the rule, look at lines 1 and 4. Right, so each of your rule forms is a formula that we're mapping on to a given derivation. So we highlight line 1, and then we click on our drop-down rule menu, and we say we've eliminated the conjunction at line 1, or we've eliminated the left side of the conjunction. Check our step, and Fitch says, yep, you're right. Now at line 5, we've said, hey, when I assume A and I infer not A from line 1, I'm in a position to, or I've now said, rather, I should say, that line, that we've got a contradiction. I'm making that contradiction explicit. And remember, this is a truth functional contradiction. Now I'm done with this side of the disjunction. I move on to the right side of the disjunction. And once again, and this is very often the case with our successive subproof sequences, we have a mirroring of the steps. This time we've assumed B. We've still eliminated, we've eliminated line 1 again. This time we've eliminated the not B. And once again, we have a contradiction. Now we're in a position to exit the nested subproof. So what we're saying at line 9 is this: hey, I have not A or B, and whether I say I have A or I have B, I generate a contradiction, right? So in either case, I end up with a logical absurdity. So I've eliminated the disjunction. Go ahead and check that. Now I'm in a position, and this goes back, Reggie, to your point, I'm in a position to say, I see now. I click somewhere in my subproof sequence and I got the whole 2 through 9. The assumption that the conclusion was false generates a contradiction, which means the conclusion must be true. It's true that neither A nor B is the case. So there's my negation intro. What do we think?
One way or another, the subproofs has to guide us to the conclusion, right?
The subproofs provide us with a framework, a roadmap, yes. We're going to see when we get to chapter 8, after we have introduced 2 more connectives, that there is a total of 4 subproof rules, or 4 rules involving subproofs. Those are our strategic rules, which is to say they set up our structuring framework, they set up the roadmap, the guide, right, to getting to the conclusion. But more specifically, Dereje, it's the conclusion itself that tells us what to do. Right?
It's the anchor.
Yes. Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about it. Yep. Okay, what do we think?